Patty's not lying about the bullying part. In the acknowledgments, I thank her for bullying me into doing it. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. The misconception I'm going to talk about is the classic adage of, we don't make them like we used to. Good. This is a good thing that we do not make them like we used to. We've made a lot of very, very bad buildings throughout Chicago's history. Look at these beautiful buildings. These are beautiful buildings, photographed for the Condition on Chicago Tenements assessment from 1900. These are considered some of the worst buildings in Chicago. A description of them can be found, or a version of them can be found in the great novel, The Jungle. Quote, "A long row of the typical frame dwellings of the neighborhood where architecture is a luxury that is dispensed with. The house was one of a whole row that was built by a company which existed to make money by swindling poor people. The family had paid $1,500 for it, and it had cost the builder $500 when it was new. They used the very flimsiest and cheapest materials, and they built the houses a dozen at a time, cared about nothing at all except the outside shine. These homes were built squished together. You had some light coming in the front, some coming in the back, but barely anything coming in from the sides. And today we have building codes that require setbacks on the front, on the sides, on the back, so you can get light into your house. But you might argue those are cheap buildings. Of course they were bad. They're cheap. Well, this is my house. I live in a very nice 1909 American four-square. It's not. I know. I'm exposing my great shame to you. I'm exposing my great shame. It's in fact wood covered in asbestos. So that's what I get. That's what I get. The walls of my house, this is not my house, but a similar one, it's balloon frame. There's nothing in them. They have an R value of 1 or 2. That's the insulation. So our house is very cold all the time until we blew in insulation, and that made things a little bit better. And then we had an addition built on the back of the house this past year with modern materials. And there is an enormous difference. I took my pizza oven thermometer back when we were at like 0 a couple weeks ago. You could see on the new side of the house, it's 66 degrees at the walls. The old side, it's 52 degrees at the walls. To say nothing of the glass. And the new side, 63 degrees, and the old side, 28. Yeah? Okay, you say, but what about brick? Surely brick is better. This is what the inside of a lot of brick walls from the turn of the century looked like. They didn't give a crap. They were throwing it in there. Yeah? It was all about speed and economy and scale. Getting as many bricks into the wall as fast as possible. The apprentices were usually the ones who were laying these bricks, and guides encouraged them to lay a brick in only 2 moves. Basically, throw down mortar, throw down a brick. Yeah? Not a lot going on. Okay, that's structural brick. But what about art? What about artistry? Louis Sullivan. This is the Gage building, Louis Sullivan's building, with these incredible terracotta details up at the top of them. Surely when you see something like this, you want to comment on it on Facebook and say, is there anyone that could possibly do this sort of thing today? Yes. In fact, that piece you are looking at was made recently in the last 10 years. This is a recreation of the original terracotta made by the Boston Valley Terracotta Company, based on measurements and scans and drawings, and then reinstalled back onto the building. So not only can it still be done, I fooled you. But, okay, that's a small piece that's been replaced. Sure. What about full buildings like these gorgeous Art Deco terracotta structures? That's incredible. Surely we can't do that today. I got you again. That's a new building. That is a 2019 New York City building called the Fitzroy, covered in a beautiful green terracotta. But it's really expensive. Yeah, the 2-bedroom, 2.5-bath costs about $5.5 million for that building. Which brings me to my next point. It's more expensive to make them like we used to. That's a big thing that's changed. And because the scale of what we produce has changed. To stick with terracotta for a minute. Terracotta used to be incredibly popular, starting from a sprinkle in the 1800s, and then by the teens, roaring into an enormous industry to build and clad our buildings. By the 1920s, there were 24 different companies making architectural terracotta around the United States, including 3 of the largest ones here in Chicago: American Terracotta in Crystal Lake, Midland Terracotta in Cicero, and Northwestern Terracotta not too far from here in Lincoln Park, just off of Clybourne. But the Great Depression hits, building stops, and when building starts again, people want concrete, they want steel, they want glass. They aren't necessarily interested in terracotta anymore. 1947, there are 7 terracotta manufacturers left in the United States. And today, in 2026, there's 2. There's only 2. And so if you wanted to build with terracotta today, you could. It's incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult. To give you an example, some architects I interviewed were working on a coach house, and they wanted to add a terracotta stringer, a little line of terracotta decoration going around it. They approached Boston Valley Terracotta in New York, one of these 2 remaining firms, and said, hey, we want 150 linear feet of terracotta. And Boston Valley said, our minimum is a few thousand square feet. Otherwise, we're not turning on the kilns. And so you can't really use terracotta like we used to. Same is true of doors. You can get a beautiful 6-panel solid wood door, but you're going to be dropping $1,000 on a door, when instead you could drop $120 on a fine door, a composite hollow door. Yes, it's worse than the solid door, but it's not necessarily $900 worse than the solid door. Yeah? But nice stuff has always kind of been expensive, too. To give another example, the Roby House, an incredible piece of design that cost in $2026 when it was built back in 1909, $360,000 for just the land, $900,000 for the house, and $258,000 for the furnishings. If you spent $258,000 on furnishings today, you could get a lot of really nice stuff. The same is true of a lot of the old apartment buildings in Chicago. This is a Greystone apartment building I lived in a long time ago in Andersonville. Nice place, 2 different built-ins. I've got a picture of one of them there. I went scrolling back through and through and through all my old cell phone photos trying to find them. This place, in 1922, I found rental advertisements, was offered for rent at $85 a month, at a time when the average income was $1,300 a month. So pretty expensive compared to other things. Also, again, an example of good, we don't build them like we used to. As I tried to find these pictures, I mostly found pictures like these of the building absolutely crumbling and falling apart. This is the building where I learned the landlord-tenant code really well, because the power went out to half the apartment for 3 weeks. A big part of why buildings are so much more expensive nowadays is labor. Labor has gotten more and more and more expensive, especially since the end of the Second World War. 1929, the average construction worker in the United States made $29,000 a year. 1970, it was $70,000. These are all adjusted to $24. And today in Chicago, the average is $82,000. Labor is the thing that is bringing the cost up and up and up. And where developers find room to cut is labor. Which brings me to my next point. We don't train them like we used to. So how have we trained our skilled tradespeople in Chicago throughout history? Well, for a long time, skilled labor in Chicago was fueled by immigrants bringing their trade with them from Europe. In the 19th century, I'll speak a lot about bricklaying labor because that's really what I know a lot about. In the 19th century Chicago, the first union was founded by Irish bricklayers, and there were 2 different German bricklaying unions as well before they all started to combine together to form the first unified. But still, into the 20th century, the Bricklayers Union circular magazine was still published in English, French, Italian, and German. So there was still a huge ethnic component and immigrant component. Carpenters, it's even greater. Chicago Union carpenters in 1930, 64 of carpenters were foreign born. 64%, of carpenters in Chicago were foreign born. And until 1984, amongst carpenter unions in Chicago, in the city alone, there were 20 different union locals divided up by region and origin, including Jewish locals, German, Finnish, Swedish, Irish, Czech, and Polish locals for the carpenters. And for a European immigrant to Chicago, it could be a great way to establish yourself and make a good living. You work for yourself, you work as a bricklayer for a while, and then you start a small company, and you grow and you grow and you grow. Two examples here are Henry Erickson, who came to Chicago in 1881 to work as a bricklayer, and he went on to form a contracting firm that then built the Manhattan Building here, the Pittsfield Tower, the Lathrop Homes. Ragnar Benson, the other man there, he immigrated in 1911, started laying bricks in 1915 after he dropped out of Austin High School. And then by the 1960s, Ragnar Benson, Inc. was one of the largest contracting firms in the country, and they're still around today. They built, probably most famously, the Belvedere Assembly Plant that you see on the expressway, and also a little more infamously, they built the cooling towers at 3 Mile Island. But there was so much reliance on European trade skills in the United States in the turn of the century that some bricklayers were warning about it, saying, quote, "We have depended so much on European skill that we have not given the attention to apprenticeship that we should, to training people rather relying on immigrant labor." And so in 1900, the first apprenticeship program was founded for the bricklayers in Chicago. This is the 1912 class of bricklayers, I believe. The unions had really resisted apprenticeship programs before this out of fear that the contractors would just hire as many apprentices as they could because they work at a lower scale of labor and pack the jobs with that. But this new agreement dictated you can only take one apprentice on per job, and there were all sorts of requirements. So who was an apprentice? Who are these people from 1912? Well, the ideal apprentice, bricklaying apprentice, was 16 to 18 and no older. You apprenticed 3 years, and you were paid a fifth to 1/3 scale of a journeyman's wages. You probably dropped out of high school, or you didn't go to high school at all, and you were thrown into the job. You learned just by doing. One 1909 union training guide described that the apprentice must be worked, quote, "hard to their full limit." An example of this, one of the things that it was recommended apprentices learn was, quote, "The fingertips will wear out occasionally by handling the bricks when wet. When the tips of the fingers become tender, the bricklayer should acquire the ability to grip the bricks by catching the edge of the brick further down on the finger. And by the time the second position of the finger wears tender, he will find the tips will be able again to stand the pressure of handling bricks." Very hard work. The apprentice started their work by just cleaning the job site, mixing mortar, learning the feel of things, observing. Then they would lay common brick on the inside walls, like we saw before. And then they'd rotate between different journeymen and learn various trades like fireplaces, flues, before they could be actually put on the wall. They also, though, sort of uniquely in Chicago, they had school in the off-season. The 3 months in the off-season, every Thursday and Friday, they would go to school learning math, plan reading, various bricklaying techniques so that they can read a plan and translate it into 3 dimensions and make corrections to what the architect had drawn. Between 1912 and 1926, 7,000 bricklaying apprentices attended that bricklaying school. But you didn't need to be an apprentice to the union to learn a trade. In 1900, only 10% of all teens attended high school. This graph shows how school attendance has increased over time. A lot of these boys finished elementary school and then went and found jobs, and a lot of them on construction sites. And Chicago Public Schools responded to this by starting a program of vocational schools. In 1903, they founded Crane Manual Training School to teach students how to work machines, how to enter the industrial world. In 1912, they made this vocational school program official, and at that point, 6th graders graduating from elementary school would be given options towards going towards more academic high school or this vocational school with a trade focus. This program was pushed by businessmen throughout the city who hired former superintendent of schools, Edwin Cooley, this guy, to do research and put forward proposals. And the business leaders like it because they needed people coming in with a certain base level of school that they wouldn't have to pay as much to train. And if they received their training in school and their lessons provided by the business people, they might be less likely to be radicals. The program was opposed by educators because they felt that it created a two-tiered system and that students would be identified at young ages of worth the academic track or go to the vocational track. It was opposed by the American Federation of Labor because it would focus on creating specialists rather than rounded tradespeople and skilled people. It was opposed by labor as a scab factory run by the bosses to turn out docile workers. Business leaders argue to create more upward mobility. The educators argue that it gave them no choice but then to start pushing kids one way or another. Ultimately, the program did go forward. The big technical schools were Crane, Lane, and Tilden. They taught things like industrial training, metalworking, woodworking to an estimated 22,000 students by the 1920s. The Washburn School was a larger, more specialized school. There they offered things like carpentry, steam fitting, plastering, electrical work. And then Chicago Vocational High School, pictured here, opened in the 30s. They added things like bricklaying and masonry to the curriculum, so you can actually learn bricklaying in school. Washburn became really unique in that they started partnering with unions, locals throughout Chicago, who would provide teachers, provide materials, provide funding to expand the offerings and get even more education. In 1956, they purchased this former carbolic acid industrial plant. It's what they used to carbonate drinks. That's not as scary as it sounds. But there was a problem that started to arise. The educators are right. Shocking. The vocational program really became, in many ways, more like reform schools. Students were identified at young ages of being put one way or the other. And the vocational program became very incredibly segregated, with black students going towards South Side vocational schools that were focused more on manual labor, less skilled work. And Washburn, into the 1960s, remained 99% white. Eventually, federal pressure in the 1980s forced the school to desegregate, but that led to the unions pulling out. They went from 17 unions based out of Washburn in 1965 to 8 in 1982 to 2 in 1993, and the school closed in 1994. Since Washburn closed, trade education in an educational setting in Chicago has really just become the domain of community colleges and city colleges. Specifically, King Kennedy is the only school in Chicago, the only Chicago city college that offers any kind of architectural or, construction training. Chicago Public Schools does have CTE, career and technical education, that they offer various programs through, but they describe it as, quote, CTE program is not vocational education. It is a sophisticated and effective combination of a rigorous college prep high school academic curriculum and hands-on training in career and technical subjects and workplace competencies. Students graduate with skills matched to employer needs and the knowledge to succeed in college or other post-secondary education, advanced career training, and immediate entry into jobs with a meaningful career path. So it is still now, we flipped very hard back towards just college. I think a necessary move back towards having paths open for everybody. But today, in the CTE program, there are 5 schools that have an architecture class, 4 a carpentry class, 2 an electrical class, 2 a welding class, and 1 an HVAC class. There is also a newer program, Chicago Builds. It's a 2-year program with construction training, off-site construction training for students. About 100 students a year go through it. But for a lot of construction training today, especially in the non-union world, which is an enormous part of Chicago construction, especially residential construction is almost entirely non-union, training is still happening on the job. And I interviewed one builder who told me that he usually is not making any money off of a new hire for 2 years because they're having to be trained and taught. And for a lot of builders, if they're not paying well, they lose people. And especially he ran into things like that in the 2008 recession, where he told me he would hire 9 people a year to keep 1. People were so often moving out. And another part of what that means is immigrants today still make up an enormous part of building trades in Chicago, because you have people coming from Poland bringing this trades there and doing it. You have people coming from Mexico bringing the trades and doing it. Or you have people who want to support their family, and it provides a way to make money quickly. There are still bricklaying apprentices, but not in as many numbers as there once were. At the end of World War II, for example, Local 21 in Chicago, the Chicago local, only had 50 apprentices. A big part of it, too, is in the post-war years, we really start to see, and still today, a lot of tradespeople pushing their kids away from it. An example is here from a short story, you might say, in a workers' magazine. They wrote, quote, a young boy goes to interview for a job at a railroad. Quote, the father's job was not good enough for the son. The father received $5 a day for laying brick, but he wanted his son to begin work in an office that would hardly pay more than that for a week's labor. But father, asked the son, why don't you want me to learn your trade? It seems I'd make more money. Learn to be a bricklayer? Questioned his father, opening for 100th time an argument that, according to his mind, had been exhausted. On the top of a cold wall with your hands freezing, your head baking in the sun? That's a fine way to live. And a strike can half the time and no money coming in. No, sir, continued the father. You shall sit at a desk and be the boss in a little while. You shall wear good clothes and ride in a private car and send telegrams instead of letters. The old man stopped to relight his pipe. The young man pictured his mind the vision presented by his father. Private car and sending telegrams. Perhaps that would be all right. This idea that I struggled, you shouldn't do it. But still today, there are apprentices, but they're not those 16 to 18-year-old boys they used to be. There's men, there's women, and the average apprentice age is about 30 today. They're people who have college educations. They're people who have worked a series of jobs, retail, call centers, dead end, who want a new start, want to try something different, working with their hands. You get paid to learn all of this, too, by the way. But let me be clear. They are just as skilled and able to do good work as their predecessors. And they want to do just as much good work as their predecessors. There are just less of them. And there's quite a bit less of them across a lot of these trades. Today in Chicago compared to 1926. 1926, 6,500 bricklayers, 2,500 carpenters, 25,000 carpenters, 13,000 painters, 2,500 plasterers, and 700 tile/mosaic setters. 2024, there are 2,500 bricklayers, 19,000 carpenters, 5,500 painters, 210 plasterers, and 620 tile setters. They no longer have the mosaic subset in there. The recession killed a lot of this too. During the recession nationally, the United States lost 2.7 million construction jobs. And that's about 10 to 20% of all the construction jobs available at the time. But wait, there's more of some of them. For example, today, back in 1926, there were 1,500 iron workers, there were 325 glaziers, 13,000 laborers, 1,200 cement and concrete workers. Today, there are 14,000 pipe fitters, 2,600 steel workers, 1,800 glaziers, 2,300 laborers, and 4,000 cement and concrete workers. So some of these trades have increased enormously because our priorities have changed. People don't want old buildings. They want steel, they want glass, they want concrete, they want a lot of lights. They want an open feeling. As homes have grown larger and larger and larger, how do you get a bigger space into your home and a more flexible space? You build boxes. Boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes. They allow you to have large windows, open spaces that are very easily moved around. Compare that to an old bungalow. A lot harder to mix and match in a space like that. Interestingly, too, the priorities of the trades have changed as well. As materials have changed, the trades have changed what they do. so that they can continue to work and provide for their members. For bricklayers, that means they're not laying a lot of brick. They're laying concrete blocks. Concrete blocks are a lot cheaper because they're a lot bigger. They fill up the wall faster. And for carpenters, it means a major part of what a union carpenter's work is building concrete forms to pour concrete into. Carpenters fought desperately hard to get that work and keep that work. The official history of the Carpenters Union, Union Brotherhood, Union Town, published in 1985, wrote, quote, "While this position has ratified the progressive deterioration of traditional wood craftsmanship, it has enabled the union to retain and even expand the amount of work available to its members. Thus, the steady decline in the use of wood in all kinds of construction, despite the steady decline in use of wood in all kinds of construction, the carpenters remain the largest building trades union in the Building Trades Council." So keeping members at work, changing to different materials. See, in the way our buildings are planned, our priorities have changed too. This is Sadlowski Elementary School on the far southeast side, built about 10 years ago. Chicago used to build on a 100-year plan, schools designed to last 100 years. Today, they build them to last 30 to 50 years. Buildings like these are not built with concrete or masonry block interior walls, that painted white concrete block all of us had in our elementary schools. They're built with industrial drywall, basically, because they're terrified of the building becoming obsolete. The building is designed to be as malleable, as easily changed as possible as classrooms change, as classroom sizes change, as education technology changes. They can adapt the building as they need to. But that said, all of us here probably would much rather prefer the idea of going to school in a building like this, right? Because we don't make them like we used to, and also I miss my grandparents. Hating buildings is one of the great Chicago and American sports. For example, this is from a 1928 article in the Chicago Tribune. "Against the prevailing type of bungalow, there has been much criticism because of its drab, monotonous outlines. For the last 3 or 4 years, there's been an epidemic of them all over Chicago. There's scarcely a locality in any suburb in the city or surrounding territory where hundreds of 4, 5, 6, and 7-story bungalows may be found. All so alike that it would take a surveyor with a compass and a flashlight to be able to identify one's home. The porches are the same, the steps, the walks, the flower beds." But it's not just the bungalows that people hated. In 1926, an architect named F.W. Fitzgerald, who had worked on the Chicago Federal Building, the old Federal Building, wrote, quote, "There are in the dozens of pages of a newspaper pictures of 30 or more commercial buildings in a bunch. Now shake all those buildings up together and then blindfolded pick one from the bunch and you have the prototype, the average of the lot. Dismal, awful monotony. Yet I repeat, that city sins no worse in that direction than do the rest of the cities. The utter sameness, the absolute absence of the slightest variation, the awful paucity of architectural expression hits one with a club." He also added, though, in case you might have something to counter, "I am not clamoring for the weird absinthe and cigarette dreams of originality that some of our French friends and Frank Lloyd Wright and his cohort perpetuate in the name of architecture. But it does seem to me we could get up a little less of the monotonous stuff. Also, the modern stuff done in England, France, Germany, Italy, and the rest of them is below par. Appallingly awful new art, bad dreams, war scares, nightmares, and a sad decadence from the estate of the European architecture of the past." 1954, Maryland McCormick, the wife of Colonel McCormick, who owned the Tribune, wrote a column in the paper where she wrote, quote, "I do not think the architecture of ancient Greece can be surpassed, but I do realize that the Acropolis would not be a comfortable place in which to live. But what a thrill to see the Parthenon. It has been one of the joys of my life. The Taj Mahal, the Milan Cathedral, Versailles, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, the Forbidden City in Beijing are high points in my memory. I have tried to like the modern glass buildings, and as I know they are practical, economical to build, and cheaper to maintain, but I hope I shall never have to live in one of those cold, austere buildings." Yeah, if this is your idea of what good architecture is, you're not going to like this. Yeah, that's just kind of how it is. She had another screamingly hot take. She wrote in that same piece, quote, "In fact, I can see beauty in almost every period throughout the ages except the Victorian. I cannot perceive one line of grace in Victorian houses or furniture." Think of how insane that sounds to us today. And then think of how somebody talks about the Thompson Center. She wasn't alone in that take on Victorian architecture in that time. 1933, Benjamin Marshall, architect of the Drake, wrote, quote, "The city's first buildings of importance and permanence were built in the period of American adaptation of the Victorian style. Such buildings as the original Palmer House, the Great Northern, the Stratford Hotel, and the Board of Trade are typical examples of what we now designate as the, quote, reign of terror in architecture." The reign of terror in architecture. This is a fun 10 minutes I got to spend. Another writer in 1956 wrote, quote, "We go to the Art Institute to look at the works of Louis Sullivan. And what did he design? Massive stone edifices with heavy Romanesque arches and intricate ornamentation which look more antiquated to the layman's eye today than far older styles. The Auditorium and Stock Exchange are two of them." They continued, "We go further and learn that Carl Schur's high school is hailed as an outstanding result of the Sullivan Revolution. We personally consider it to be one of the ugliest buildings in town." They went on to say, "The fact that many of these pioneer modern buildings look old and ugly is no reflection of their designers, is because modern architecture has been in such a state of flux we haven't had time to get used to anything. The same is true of vehicles. A 25-year-old Stutz looks more out of style than a 50-year-old milk wagon or a 300-year-old royal coach simply because horses and wagons reached maturity in design long ago. Well, automobiles change from year to year. Could you select a car today that would look stylish in 1980? Here's that 25-year-old Stutz she's talking about that looks very out of style. And here's a 1956 car from the year the piece was written. Would it still look stylish in 1980? Would a 1980 car still look stylish today? Would a car that is 25 years old still look stylish today? Which brings us to our next point. You don't just like architecture, you like fashion. It's not just buildings. Everything in art moves on a timeline. It's new, eventually it's historic, but in between it's just old. It is your grandparents' house, it is your dentist's office. But as things age, they become historic again, they become trendy again, in buildings and in clothes. Gen Z has adopted the 90s and go around cavorting like my middle school bullies. But the same happens in design. But when is that cutoff? When historic is just, when old becomes historic, or historic comes to old? 1600s? Is it the 1700s? The 1910s? The 1960s? The 1980s? I think we found it. This, quick aside, this is a house I got to photograph in Naperville. It was built in 1979 by a bricklayer as his forever home. Every single wall is brick. I photographed in 2023 when he moved out, so no one had ever lived in it at that point. The 1990s? Let's meet back here in 30 years and see what sounds we make. Which brings us to new construction. Today, so much new construction is like a model, like a fashion model. It is a thing that style can be put upon. No strong choices are made because clothing is cheap and you can just get something else next season to stay up with the trends. That's why developers love this sort of thing, these boxes like this. Speaking of, developers don't pay for them like they used to. And they're not building for you. I'm talking about you. Developers drive everything. And by the virtue of you being here, they are not interested in you. They are interested in Jake and Kaylee. Kaylee is from Downers Grove, and she works in marketing for a logistics firm. Jake is from Richmond, Virginia, and works in real estate. And they just want a place with 4 white walls, as much interior space as possible, a modern kitchen, an in-unit washer, dryer. They're looking to move out of Wrigleyville, and they want someplace that feels like the West Loop, but has a little more space for their doodle, Tyson. And developers aren't going to build your 90s Tuscan revival kitchen because Jake and Kaylee don't want that. They're not going to buy a house where they have to spend the money to rip that out and put in new countertops and cabinets when they could just buy an exceedingly neutral, cheap, modern kitchen that can be replaced in an instant because in 6 years, they're going to sell and move out to Arlington Heights because they want a yard for the kid and the city just doesn't feel safe anymore. The materials at our disposal today are so cheap and so standardized and can be replaced across brands and across types. And so because fashion is changing today faster than it ever has before, and buildings are, for the first time, able to respond with it. And we're staying staying in our homes for a lot less time. 1939, a WPA survey found that 50% of Chicago homeowners had been in their home for 10 to 20 years, and that 25% had been in their homes for 20 years or more. There was an expectation at that time that you were buying a home for generations. You were staying there. Other generations would come and go, and the home was forever. But since the Second World War, that hasn't been the case. People have been so much more mobile, the highways, airplanes, work from home, and people stay in their houses for a lot less time. In 1980, the median length of home ownership in the United States was 8 years. Today, it's 15 years. It's a little better. But developers drive everything, and they want to build what's cheap and what's easy, what moves off the proverbial clothing rack with maximum return before fashion changes again, and then until then, they will build the same things over and over and over and over and over again. As I was looking around at things, I found a great quote from an architect from earlier this year. He wrote, quote, "Suppose that some of our architecture of this day and generation might last for several hundreds of years, which it certainly will not. What a curious estimate of our present civilization an architect of the future would make if he might study some of the current styles. These people," he would say, "they were either extremely lazy or in awful hurry. They seem to have copied, approximately, things that other people remembered. They must have lived standardized lives according to some standardized, mediocre system. There was an uninteresting sameness in all that they did over a tremendous area. They seem to have never thought, never analyzed. They must have been machine mad. Is this dear America of ours just rushing along at breakneck speed and never stopping to think?" Oh, shoot, I wrote that down wrong. He said that in 1926. Shoot, I should have checked that. America's favorite sport. Anyway, shut up and show me some good buildings. There are a lot of good buildings out there today, and here's just a small smattering of some of my favorites in the Chicago area. It's a CA6, a condo building in the West Loop, designed by SGW, built a few years ago. Its design is inspired by a Louis Sullivan warehouse at the base, with that modern top, but it has these thick masonry arches throughout it, laid by hand by bricklayers. Bricklayers want to do this. Again, they want to do this because bricklayers all have some weird disease in their mind that means they spend every weekend driving their families around and saying, "I built that, I built that, I built that, I built that." The Thayer Weave House in Evanston, designed by Brooke Scarpa and Studio Dwell, with this screen wall that spins at different rates. This is incredibly technical, slow work, expensive work, but beautiful work. The Oak Park Modular Home by Tom Bassett Dilley Architects. This home was designed and built as 6 different modules in a factory and then assembled on site for low cost and quick construction. But it's still making a lot of really interesting choices. in color, in material, in composition, despite the fact that it is not very expensive. An architect named Kristen Fogarty Yee is one I really like, who mixes classic designs and more modern contemporary things. That's her building that she lives in over here. It's a 1913 glazed brick building where the brick was crumbling off. And so she had it all taken down and put back up in this black gray gradient with blue bricks sprinkled through it, tying in with the historic look, but then giving it a distinctly modern feel. Same goes for this bathroom with the tile that runs across the floor up the wall, and then a fairly traditional entryway there on that side. Parkside of Old Town, affordable housing by LBBA, one of the best designers of affordable housing in Chicago. They play so much with color, and they use concrete. They use cheaper materials, but they're very intensely believe that color needs to play a role in things as a way of placemaking, of wayfinding. Oh, I live in the yellow one there. And it makes the buildings more lively and interesting on the street, too. This is one of my favorite ones, and it's not a brick building at all. This is the Row in Fulton Market. It's very easy to spot. It's a steel and glass tower. But instead of just having the standard box, I see the face you're making, Patty. Instead of having the standard box, they take an inspiration from the structural arches on the Lake Street L with just that little bit of a curve. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it makes for a building that is, to me, much more appealing. The Boys and Girls Club in Austin by Leighton Design. Again, it's metal, it's concrete, it's glass. But it's using interesting forms, this stepped out feature, this metal screen, and then these bright colors, having things be visually interesting and colorful. One of my favorites, Schuba's Tide House, designed by Lee Greenberg of Gensler. A modern building attached to a 1901 Schlitz saloon, restaurant below, event space up above. Borrowing this has punched out form, borrowing the shape from the little red brick decorative details on Schuba's, creating a dialogue there, and creating this feeling of this weight of masonry floating over glass. And there it is on the inside, and you could see the steel that's actually holding it up. And this is a case where there had to be so much planning and meetings between the bricklayer, the steel fabricator, and the steel worker so that it could all stay perfectly hidden out of sight. And they were willing to do that because people like to do work that is good. The new red line stations. Here's a fun thing. Those red pillars there, that's terracotta. That's terracotta rain screen, a modern version of terracotta. It is terracotta, and it's used here because it's bright, it's vibrant, it's the red line, and it can withstand a hell of a lot more beating than a metal panel can. This is how terracotta has evolved into 2026. So, in conclusion, we don't make them like we used to. We make them different than we used to, and often better than we used to, and with the same labor deployed differently than we used to, and with different priorities and amenities than we used to, and with different fashions than we used to, and with different materials than we used to, and both cheaper and more expensive than we used to, and with shorter life expectancies than we used to. And at the end of the day, if a new building sucks, blame capitalism and blame the developer. If I can, I'll make a plug. As Patty mentioned, I run a company called Brick of Chicago. I lead walking tours of 11 different neighborhoods around Chicago, from Rogers Park in the north to Beverly in the south to Austin Oak Park in the west. Season starts April 19th. They're a lot of fun. Asked many people in here who've taken them, and some people have taken all 11 of them, including the legendary Susan O'Brien, who did all, at that point, 9 in one summer. And I also have Thank you. It's gonna be bad for me. at least nobody saw it. I have a book. It's been a labor of love for the last 4 years at this point. It's called Fire and Clay. It's published by the University of Chicago Press. I'm immensely proud of it. It is all the history of brick architecture and brick as a design material throughout Chicago. It has 102 pictures that I took and some really great stuff. I got to interview an enormous amount of talented people and architects and bricklayers and brick makers for the book. If you pre-order, it'll be shipping out in like 2 or 3 weeks or 4 or 5 weeks. I don't really know. This is all very opaque. There is going to be a launch party that once I finally write the description for it and get it through, will be public. It'll be May 5th at the Dree House. It'll be me in conversation with Jeffrey Baer, which I'm really excited about. Finally, again, a huge thanks to Chicago for Chicagoans. Truly, I'm doing a big part of how I'm able to do this as my job is thanks to Patty, and they do incredible work. Chicago for Chicagoans does these talks and throughout the year. So please support them, and thank you so much for coming today.